Let me introduce our panel to you. Chris Levi, who's Executive Director of Sphere, an eminent neurologist and an innovator himself with one of the emblematic programs to treat stroke in Australia and a pioneer in that area. Annabelle Bennett, an eminent jurist, judge, and Chancellor of Bond University. Les Bouquet, who's already been presaged here, Foundation Professor of Surgery and Clinical Dean, Western Sydney University at Liverpool Hospital. Please welcome our panel. I noticed, Charlie, that one of your pillars of your strategy is government as exemplar. God help us. I mean, the government has failed top to bottom, side to side. I mean, they're not an exemplar at all. Failed IT programs, My Health Record has spluttered, eventually it's coming through. Why should we think of government as an exemplar, or indeed need them to be an exemplar?
Well, I think...
certainly not at the moment.
Yeah, certainly there's been a number of very high-profile challenges in the rollout, particularly of the digital agenda of the government. On the flip side, I think there have been some slightly quieter success stories.
Oh, really?
I read recently that the ABS managed to deliver the same-sex marriage survey $20 million under budget, on time and flawless. 80% of the Australian population voted, and that process worked really well. So I don't think that necessarily the narrative that government can't get anything right is correct. Having said that, innovation is challenging.
So here's a hypothesis to put to you. Sorry, can we have the house lights up so I can see the audience if somebody wants to ask a question, please? Innovation needs to be isolated from government. If government gets in the way, we've got a problem.
Well, certainly, I think one of the things that we in this country should do is be less inclined to look to government for direction. I think that we need to define our own future more aggressively as individual firms. But the reality is that the government is the largest firm in the economy. And the economy can't be innovative if government itself is not actually leading the way.
But I won't press this, but I mean, one of the first things the Howard government did was actually remove funding from the photovoltaic cell. So we had a world leadership position and we lost it because of the influence of the coal industry. I mean, we've got a problem, haven't we?
Well, and I would argue one of the reasons why we created the Biomedical Translation Fund is to prevent exactly the same kind of thing happening in the health and medical research sector going forward. So I certainly would agree that we, as a nation, haven't always made the right calls, but I think we're getting better. And I think the BTF's a great example of that. Annabelle,
what do you think are the legislative changes that need to be made? I mean, we've got, and one of the themes here is failure, accepting failure. The United States seems much more accepting of failure than we are. We've got some people would say quite brutal insolvency laws. And so if you fail in business, you're not allowed to be a director for a while. There are all sorts of rules and regulations about that. So you become risk averse. I mean, what do you think are the legislative changes that facilitate here?
I don't think I'd actually cast my mind to that, although I have to say, in going to that tech trade mission, the first all-female tech trade mission to Israel last year, the thing that caught my attention the most was the recognition that 90% of startups fail, and that is not considered a negative. That's considered, if anything, a learning experience, and that person is the person you support the next round. And so you are right. The United States may have the same view, and certainly in the US they have very different bankruptcy laws, as we all know. You are right. I think that if people are going to get over the risk, I mean, we do have a risk-averse mentality, I think, that's developed in Australia. I think it's partly because there's a much greater emphasis in a lot of companies, I think, as I hear anecdotally, that people are risk-averse because it's a bit like any invention. With the benefit of hindsight, things become obvious. It's the same thing when you look in the area that I'm interested in, patent law. When people look back on an invention and they say, well, that was obvious, I could have done that immediately, because you're looking back the same way people look back in business and say, well, that was clearly a risky strategy and should never have been undertaken. So I think I think you are right. I think people have to, if the government can do something, it would be to look again at those questions. I think that is probably one of the biggest ones, our bankruptcy laws and our attitude towards commercial failure.
But sticking with...
and director's responsibility and liability, which of course is a very difficult balance to achieve.
So what are you going to recommend in your strategic plan about insolvency law?
I can't talk in detail about what's in our strategic plan, although I would say that changes to insolvency law were part of the NISA package 2 years ago. Some of them have had a little bit more challenge getting through the Parliament than others, but it remains an area of active discussion in the government. So,
Annabelle, you handed down a judgment in favour of Myriad Genetics as for the patenting of the BRCA gene, which subsequently overturned by our High Court, US Supreme Court kind of backed our High Court, well, it came to a similar decision. Why did you decide that? And what was kind of, without going into a 3-day handing down of a judgment, why did you decide that you could patent a gene? Because some would say, on one side that helps innovation, but on the other side it hampers it because it limits people's ability to utilize that technology fully for the benefits of the community.
I know that it's an issue about which people feel quite strongly in terms of that balance. The decision that we made at the Federal Court, the first instance judge and then the 5 judges who sat on the appeal, of whom I was one, we looked at it in classic principles, which is an isolated gene sequence. The work had been done, the gene sequence had been isolated, so it was new, it was something, and that it was classic laws, it was patentable. That was the view we took. The High Court, we did not look at it on a question of balances. I mean, patent law, since for the last 400 years, has involved balancing the rights of the inventor and the rights and the public. I mean, the whole concept of a patent is that it's a contract between an inventor and the public, which is you give me all the details of your invention, and as a result, we will give you a monopoly, but the deal is that after that monopoly is over, the public has the full right to work the invention, and you've had to disclose every single thing about it that enables that public to work it. So that was the original deal. That's the balance. Different countries have taken different views over time, but usually something that initially is a big invention and people worry about the impact of it, later on, of course, it becomes the norm and it gets defeated on grounds of obviousness if the next one comes along. What the High Court, so that we did it classic ways. It was inventive, there was an inventive step, that was conceded. It was conceded that the work was highly inventive. Absolutely not in question. And I mean, huge epidemiological studies led to the ability to find where the polymorphs and mutations were. What the High Court did was to come in much more from what you raised, which is the policy principle, and said, and they used the expression 3 times in the majority judgment, that patents have a chilling effect on innovation. Now, there was no evidence about that, no evidence at all. That was the High Court's own take on it, without any evidence or any reference to any works on it. There was no study of it, it was just a stated fact. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that yes, one can argue that patents have a chilling effect on innovation or invention in a lot of areas, but on the other side of it, who's going to fund the research if there's no patent at the end of the rainbow? Because if the money's coming in from venture capitalists, if you take the balance, and pharma is a good example, if the money's coming in, the first question people want is, well, why should I invest millions and millions of dollars in this invention if the minute I bring it to market, every competitor is going to come out and do it more cheaply, and I've got nothing at the end of it? So the High Court didn't look at that balance, but yes, it did just come out and say 3 times that patents have a chilling effect on innovation. I could argue that for 400 years that has not been proven. In fact, the contrary. Les,
Charlie, in a sense because he's paid to, gave us a very optimistic view of current innovation, but it was largely potential. We've got 4 or 5 big success stories, some smaller ones, but we're still not great in realising the potential to, into action, are we not, in international terms? What are the numbers?
So I can't tell you the numbers, but Australia does very well in terms of innovation and invention. Where we fail, I'm not afraid of failure, I think it's good to fail, is we can't commercialise it. We don't have the capacity to commercialise it. And pity the poor researcher or the poor research team who are writing a book without a publisher to publish the book. So there's no point in writing a book if it's not going to be translated and read. So if you want to translate research, you need professionals. And I think this is what's lacking in Australia. We don't have professional teams affiliated with research teams that can translate the research into
But hold on a
commercial.
second, every university, and University of New South Wales is probably one of the first to have its own commercialisation arm, and they've had them for decades.
Yes, but they're not embedded within research teams, and I think that's where we need a cultural transformation to embed that culture within research. At the moment, you've got researchers, they apply for grants, they get grants, they're very happy, they work away, but they don't really know the next step, and they don't know how to get to that next step. And for that, you
So
need
we've wasted our
professionals.
money on these commercialisation arms in universities, have we?
Can you say again?
We've wasted our money on these
I don't know that we've
commercialisation
wasted
arms?
our money, but in order to get value for your money, it's got to be embedded within research teams. So research teams need to be able to reach them.
So what's your
readily.
view on this? Just get rid of the UniQuests and others and decentralise the commercialisation, or what, Chris?
Perfect segue into the partnership game, Norman, because I think the problem is there is a bit of a disconnection, especially with clinical innovation. I think biotech, the pathways are becoming clearer, and the structures that have been set up are linking more effectively than they were. There's big efforts from the unis to link into the MRIs and into healthcare. But in healthcare particularly, if you look at clinical innovation, capture and development, our connectivity is patchy at best, I think, and there needs to be more attention paid to that side of development. And I was going to say, one of the problems there, of course, is not so much the structures. I think it's an accountability issue inside the healthcare bureaucracy. So we can have top-down encouragement to link, but our accountability frameworks inside health for research and innovation, I think you know yourself, are fairly limited. It's beginning in research. I think in innovation inside health, we think we curate and develop, but I think we're kidding ourselves to some extent.
Rainbow?
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's a really hard call as to what to do with the university-led innovation centres, because over the years that I've been involved with universities, I think that I've seen it go from the small to the large, and now I see that Les is commenting going back to the small. I think the difficulty with having overarching bodies is picking what's going to work and what's not going to work, I think, and also the cost of maintaining patent portfolios broadly for the one or two that are going to come through. The other thing that I think is how much you pay people, the quality of the people you get into that. And of course, the trouble with if you embed people too much down the line, are you going to be able to afford to pay the person who's helping you do the innovation and having that contact with the business community enough? And if you go too big, how are they going to know the detail of the research that they're going to deal with? At one stage, I thought we should have actually an overarching one for the whole group of 8. When I was at ANU, and I thought that would be a better way of doing it, because then, you really can have bigger and better people doing it. I think now people are paying better as they realise that you need to do that. But I think it's a really difficult question as to where you pitch that, or do you leave it up to individual research heads to have their own contact with the business community, and then you can have too many people putting out too many fingers at the one time.
So, Chris, how do you re-incentivise researchers at the bench or at the clinic? Because the clinic's probably a bit better than the bench. It's essentially a competitive enterprise. There's no prize for being second. You've got to be first. You've got people applying for NH and MRC grants who've already done the research because they don't want to give their peer reviewers a lead as to what they're doing. So they've already done that, and they use the NH and MRC grant for something else. I mean, this is what goes on. I mean, and they're more willing to collaborate with somebody in San Diego than somebody in North Sydney. So how do you change this incentive of secrecy, of competitiveness, which is one of the strengths, but it's also one of the extraordinary weaknesses, so that the process of discovery, even before you get to translation, is a bit stuffed up?
Look, I think you need that to drive quality. I don't think there's any doubt that you need that competition to
yeah, but this is all kumbaya. We're going to collaborate,
yeah.
we're going to have partnerships and so on. It's a lot of bullshit.
Well, look, no, I think... Look, I think at that level you do need to be driving quality, and competition is a great driver for quality, we know that. But when you've got a clinical discovery, let's say you've run a trial and you've got a discovery and you've got something that you want to do with that beyond your phase 2B or phase 3 trial. That's where I think the researchers come up with a mindset block or sometimes a connectivity block, and that's where I think we need to do much more work in terms of not only the Sphere Partnership, which we're looking to develop pathways beyond that, but also across the nation. Our clinical trials networks are quite high functioning, I agree, but our clinical trials machinery at the coalface needs a lot of work.
But we spend a fortune on wet lab research in this country. Do we get the benefits? We've got venetoclax, we've got the Metcalfe Prize on Friday, which is going to go to somebody with an acute myeloid leukemia development. So, we're getting there. Ironically, the Metcalfe Prize, Don Metcalfe, fantastic discovery, billions of dollars lost to Australia because we didn't commercialise colony-stimulating factors. I mean, Blaise, what's your comment on this?
So, look, I think this is where the clinical academic groups that Ian talked about earlier on come into play. These are not groups of 4 or 5. These are groups across the partnership where you've got clinicians, researchers, academics, all interested in similar broad spectrum health issues. And I've been impressed at how fruitful these groups come together and collaborate. So I think there is much to be said about bringing clinicians and bringing back the clinician scientist within the grouping of academics and researchers.
Charlie, I want to ask you about the interface. I kind of alluded to it earlier, but the interface between social policy and innovation policy. So Japan's economy has stalled now, since the early 1990s. A very innovative culture, very good at putting research into commercial practice, and large corporations, more successful than ours, and yet the economy's stalled, and one reason it's stalled, arguably, is their lack of immigration. It's a country that's been isolated and doesn't welcome migrants. We have welcomed migrants. That's probably the reason why we've got an increase in GDP year on year, and some very educated migrants to Sydney and Melbourne. So how fragile is that enterprise? I mean, you kind of said, well, we can't rely on that forever, but it is a source of our prosperity and future, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly I think of relevance to the science and innovation community, the ability to access top talent internationally is crucially important. So immigration does, and we think should continue to play a key role in the vibrancy of our innovation system particularly. As to the ability of, I guess, a vibrant innovation system to overcome broader kind of macroeconomic challenges as Japan has faced, that's probably outside of my expertise.
And to his great credit, Tony Abbott was the person who increased migration, but there are risks here, and presumably you're arguing, that this community, broadly, locally and nationally, understand the social policy underpinnings of success.
Yes, I think it's really important that we as a community make the case for a very open, internationally connected innovation system, because I think that's a case that from time to time needs to be restated and reminded.
So one of the things I was going to ask you, sorry I'm speaking on you a little bit, but there are so many issues that are really important. One is venture capital and private equity. And we've been accused over the years of having a very immature venture capital community who are risk averse. It's got to be de-risked much more than the United States. It's got to be de-risked, even though there is a lot of money slushing around the Australian system. To what extent is that still true, and how much have we got to unlock that more?
Yeah, so venture capital is actually one of those really interesting things, because I think what you said about the lack of availability has been true for such a long time, but it is changing really, really fast. And there are 3 things that I think we see happening in the venture capital sector at the moment. The first is the absolute numbers are just growing really fast, right? So for the last 3-4 years, the amount of venture capital raised in this country has doubled each year. So last year, it exceeded $1 billion of new venture capital raised. I think that's the highest it's been ever, but it's certainly the highest it's been in the last decade. And that's significant new money. So that's the first thing. The second thing is not just the quantum of that money, but the nature of the funding. So I think it's about a third of that money came from institutional investors like superannuation funds. So for a long time, we've bemoaned the fact that superannuation funds were not investing in venture capital. That trend is starting to change.
But it's still going into fintech and software rather than necessarily scientific bench to clinic innovation.
$500 million of it is in the biomedical translation fund category, and there are other health and medical research funds. So it's not all going into fintech and tech. But I think on venture capital, the scene is changing very, very rapidly in a good way.
We've only got a few minutes left. If you've got any questions or comments, raise your hand. Sorry, Ian Jacobs, we get a microphone down to Ian, thanks. And if there's anybody else, and there's another question up in this corridor here. Ian, why don't you, it's going to take a while for a microphone. I think we've got one. Good.
Thanks,
You're on.
Is this working? Yep.
Yep.
I've had my say in a way, so perhaps I should have stayed quiet, but I can't resist venting my frustration at the tone, Norman, that you're introducing to this, which involves so many myths and misplaced thoughts. The first is that Australia is hopeless at this, and that's just not true. The research that UNIP push out into the Australian economy is responsible for 10% of Australian GDP right now, and that's without anyone even trying. So Australia is really good. $160 billion a year comes from that research. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the suggestion that academics are not interested in translating their work. Academics get up in the morning. They live and breathe to translate their work. The problem is that we don't have the incentives and the resources to help them do it. And the third is that our researchers are somehow awash with money. And that, I think, is the really crucial thing. Australia has done very well for the last 20, 30 years on raw materials, things you dig out of the ground. And it hasn't really invested sufficiently in this innovation agenda. And there is a move to do that now. But it's not really happening to any significant extent. If you look at every country in the world where this has been a success, whether it's Israel, Silicon Valley in the United States, Singapore, Hong Kong, and of course now China, where masses of money is going in, there is enormous public funding pumped in at the beginning. The idea that you can do this without enormous amounts of public funding to drive it, and then that is picked up by investment funds from the private sector further on the pipeline. Unless you have those things, it doesn't matter how many brilliant academics you have working on it and wanting to translate it, it just won't happen. But despite that, Australia has some incredible successes. HPV vaccination, cochlea, Wi-Fi. You could go on with a long list. It's an amazing story, but it won't really deliver its full potential for Australia without public investment and private investment.
Liz?
Well, I think both public and private investment tend to be attracted to places that take risks. If you look at the Technion in Israel, they attract a huge amount of venture capital, and a significant proportion of their work fails. So people who invest know that they take risk. One of my concerns in Australia is that both public and venture capital are loath to take risk, and that culture needs to be changed.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathy. Kathy Refshaugi from Sydney University, just showing that we can collaborate across the Anzac Parade. And I agree with everything that Ian said. We've been talking about innovation as from an Australian national perspective, but actually there are intrastate differences. And what industry says to us at Sydney Health Partners quite often is that it's much easier to do business in Victoria than in New South Wales. And so even if there's a lot of innovation in New South Wales, they will roll it out in Victoria because the processes, the government, everything is much easier to work with in Victoria.
It's the old problem, Victoria. But I mean, that's partly supporting Ian's argument, is that the state government funding of research and science has been much higher historically in Victoria and Queensland than in New South Wales. So there's been a bit more front loading, which is really the point that Ian's making.
Yeah, although I think part of the challenge in sort of doing business is around some regulatory frameworks and the like, and we do have the challenge of a federalised healthcare system where state governments play a key role, and so you do see differences in the way health is delivered and played out at the state level. I don't think we're going to change that anytime soon, so we need to make sure.
But so is it a
federalised
myth
system
that
works better.
Victoria is better at this than New South Wales? Which is the
I haven't seen any data to show that. Being from a proud Victorian, I won't comment, but I haven't seen any data.
We've got time for one more. Yes, here in front, in second front row.
Here. Josephine Chow from Southwestern Sydney Local Health District. I think as what Barney been saying, that the local health district and the health network has been heavily involved. I'm here. Yeah, so heavily involved and invest into SPEAR. I got a strong link, particularly last year with SPEAR. But my question was that when we actually doing innovation idea, a lot of the time is actually on the ground in the health system, in the hospital, by the trainee, by the junior medical staff. All the questions come up. All right, then they need help, like what Les been talking about. And the senior researcher, medical academic, when you want to talk to them in January, February, March, they're too busy writing NHMRC. They say, come back later. Then in April to August is the hospital busiest time of the year when winter time. Then the administrators say, no, come back later after winter. So we haven't really got much time left to try to support all those innovation ideas. I think that's the challenge that we got all the expertise here, commercialization system in place, university. We're really good at dating. We're really not good at getting them to go in wedding ceremony and get ambassadors. I think that's a challenge that I'm pretty sure that the panel actually got a solution for that.
Chris Levi?
Thanks, Josephine. I fully agree. I think the health service is a challenge to develop, even to identify and curate and then link, even in the most basic sense, good clinical innovations to further development. And I think that is one of the roles that the academic health science partnerships need to play, because they can link health services into the various conduits to support, develop, potentially invest in, and potentially bring partners to the table. So I think across the nation, and we'll hear a bit more about this tomorrow, we have an alliance of our 9 centres, the 7 advanced health and the 2 regional centres, and we're looking seriously at how we can help the health services to curate and bring forward some of those very grassroots clinical innovations, such as improvements in models of care and things that make a pretty direct difference if they can be invested in, scaled up and rolled out more rapidly.
Please thank our panel and our speaker, Charlie Day. Thanks.